There are calls for the United States and its allies to reassess infrastructure offerings to stall China's continuing influence and access in the Indo-Pacific via its Belt and Road Initiative. Joining us live now is Hayley, Senior Policy Fellow at the Perth USAsia Centre. Appreciate your time, Hayley, thank you. Firstly, just set the scene for us. How much progress has China made on the Belt and Road Initiative? I assume the pandemic may have slowed things down a bit.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Ash. So people might have heard of China's Belt and Road Initiative. It's been going for about a decade now, and China has spent billions of dollars all over the world, from Europe to the Pacific, building everything from bridges, railways, roads, and also upgrading ports and airstrips. And in the face of this, Australia and our partners and allies have been trying to deliver an alternative, but we've been really struggling to actually make traction on the ground, and that's why I've released a new report for the Perth USAsia Centre called Can Rubber Meet the Road?
And in this report, I see that you look closely at our region, the Indo-Pacific, and looking at these calls in particular for Australia and the US and our partners to step up as a real alternative to China. We've all obviously seen the recent debate over a potential Chinese military base in the Solomons. That debate really highlighted the need for us to do more in this space. Does that simply mean throwing buckets of money to some of these nations in a bid to compete with China?
So that is the key question that we're really grappling with. The fact that China is really playing to its strengths by exporting its infrastructure capacity. I mean, you might have seen all of those ghost cities in China that actually really shows that China is able to build things quickly and cheaply. And so it's a really competitive offering for developing countries that are really keen to have critical infrastructure, be it roads or electricity, or even projects for elites. So in that sort of context, Australia, the United States, Japan and other countries are trying to pool their resources so that they can have something that's similar to China's Belt and Road. The problem is that we haven't been able to actually make progress on the ground. So a few years ago, Australia, the US and Japan announced a trilateral infrastructure partnership. They've also announced an infrastructure pillar as part of the Quad initiative. And the US and Japan, as part of the G7, the group of 7 countries, have also announced the Partnerships for Global Infrastructure. So there's been a lot of emphasis on announcements, but there hasn't actually been a lot of actual tangible progress on the ground. So far, all that Australia, Japan and the US have been able to achieve working together is a single undersea fibre optic communications cable in the Pacific. Now, the cost of that project was $30 million. In contrast, in the first half of this year alone, China spent $30 billion on infrastructure. So you can see that, we're really not cutting it at the moment, and something's got to give, which is why I wrote the report, was to basically provide some practical recommendations for how they could get things moving.
And one of those, Hayley, is you write about the need for the US and its allies to coordinate rather than cooperate. Why is that distinction so important?
Great question. What I want you to imagine is, if you've got many different countries, Australia, the United States, Japan, others like maybe India and New Zealand, all trying to get their bureaucracies to come together, it creates basically a roadblock. So in Australia, we have the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, but in the United States, there are at least 7 different domestic agencies tasked with overseas infrastructure. And it's the same in Japan. There's lots of different bureaucracies all kind of trying to come together. And so what you get is, imagine these countries were on different roads and you have one main highway and they're all converging and there's a roadblock. That's basically the situation we're in now, where the bureaucracies are too busy talking about individual priorities, individual funding lines, and what you have is a sort of stalemate in terms of what we can build. That's why I say we should coordinate rather than cooperate, because we can do things a lot faster if we work independently of one another, and we should coordinate our efforts. So Australia can tell the United States, in the Pacific, we're going to do X, Y and Z, whereas whether it be roads or railways or bridges. And in the same way, the United States can have its priorities, whether that's in Southeast Asia or South Asia. So I think if we actually try and coordinate, we'll be able to make more progress on the ground, and developing countries and the private sector will also see that we have a competitive offering.
You mentioned there are key differences between how China does things compared to the US. We know that, for example, when China builds infrastructure in other countries, they use Chinese labour. The US uses local labourers, for example. When you pit them against each other in terms of the projects that they've completed, how do things compare when it comes to speed, but also quality of those projects?
Well, this is the main problem, is that China is able to build almost anything, anywhere, for anyone. And the United States is really not prepared to do that. So the US has a lot of restrictions in terms of what it will actually build and who it will build it for. So China doesn't really ask many questions, and it's also building things that are low quality. The other thing that China does is it participates in corruption. And there's also this issue of elite capture, where China is able to basically influence elites in developing countries through building vanity projects, whether it's convention centres in Papua New Guinea or major 6-lane highways in Papua New Guinea, which are highways to nowhere. In contrast, the US is not able to compete in that sense. We're not able to participate in any kind of corruption. And we also want to build things that are really high quality. But that's actually quite limiting, because sometimes developing nations aren't looking for the highest quality offering. They're looking for something that will be built quickly and is able to help their communities actually grow and build their economies. So what we need to do is sort of cut out some of the barriers to entry. We need to start building things more quickly so that we can compete with China in that sense. And we also need to demonstrate the value of our offering, why the quality is a better investment, why it's going to be a better asset over the long term. And that's quite a hard message to sell, because it costs more upfront, and you need developing countries to have more buy-in. But essentially what we need to do is make our offering as attractive or more attractive to what China is offering.
Yeah, which is, it might not be as easy as it sounds. A very complex issue, Hayley Chen. I really appreciate you taking us through some of the key issues there. Thanks for your analysis.
My pleasure.